The first conundrum awaits us, a paradox that will inform the rest of our investigation through this labyrinth. We're on the hunt for keys to investigate whether European medieval architecture has a lost history or lost function that the conventional narrative has conveniently buried. How to begin such a tremendous investigation? A good starting point is to identify periods in history where a transition could have occurred, a potential moment where these structures changed significantly. This means we need a timeline. We also need to establish some scope. Medieval architecture is far too vague a term. There is too much generalization here. Medieval architecture encompasses fortifications, city walls, tunnel systems, domestic edifices, and religious sites. We are going to start with the ecclesiastical structures, the cathedrals, minsters, abbeys, monasteries, churches, and chapels. For instance, if the cathedrals had a long and hidden interaction with water, whether it was for energy production, occult practices, or something else, this interaction had to cease at some point. There had to be a moment of change when these structures became the sites we know so well today. For anyone familiar with the history of European medieval architecture, there are three obvious choices when it comes to identifying a potential point of transition. The first point of transition is the immediate period following the end of the Middle Ages, in the 1400s. We can call this period the aftermath. The second is the birth of an exclusive Gothic style of architecture. Before the 1100s, most medieval ecclesiastical structures were composed of a very understated and modest style of masonry, utterly beautiful. In Europe, it's called Romanesque. In Britain, it's referred to as Norman architecture. It utilized the rounded arch. However, in the 1100s, a unique Gothic style began to dominate. The Gothic style is primarily defined by the exclusive use of the pointed arch, rib vaulting, and flying buttresses, those half arches that support the structure. Why did this occur? The rise of the Gothic style in the 1100s is our second point of transition. The third and final point of transition is the Gothic Revival, or Victorian-Restoration, that gained momentum in the 19th century and resulted in the widespread restoration of almost all medieval structures in Britain. Almost 80% of them, to be a little more precise. Of course, the timeline here and the proposed points of transition rely on us to believe what's written in the history books. How can we be sure the timeline is correct? How can we determine just how old these structures are? Is the timeline fabricated and imposed upon these structures, or do they actually speak the same story? What is a stone actually telling us? Let's find out. It's time to examine our first conundrum of the labyrinth. The Ship of Theseus is a paradoxical thought experiment that asks whether an object, in this case a ship, that has had all of its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. If the Ship of Theseus were kept in a harbour and every part of the ship were replaced one at a time, would it then be a new ship? When it comes to these medieval ecclesiastical structures, this paradox is particularly pertinent. Although not all medieval religious structures adopt the cruciform, the shape of the cross, it does tend to be the most common structural layout. This section of the cruciform structure is called the nave. The word nave comes from the medieval Latin navum or navis. The etymological root of navis means ship. In his fantastic book, writer Christopher Somerville calls Britain's cathedrals the ships of heaven. Britain's medieval ships of heaven are all, in their own way, the Ship of Theseus. It's no great secret that Britain's medieval cathedrals are maintained by a set of on-site masons. They are continually replacing the damaged and end-of-life stone blocks on these structures. After 200 years of such maintenance, how much of the original structure remains? Would a cathedral still be the same cathedral if all of its aging blocks had been imitated perfectly and replaced? Over a long period of time, this may end up a reality. Restoration masons use the same original stone type. Once it weathers and ages, how will we tell what is new and what is original? Is it still the original structure if new forms of gargoyles and decoration have been put in place by restoration masons? The ship of Theseus, the ships of heaven. And, as you're about to see, it goes a lot deeper than mere preservation. And we need to look at these significant changes if we want to investigate whether the cathedral, as a form in and of itself, once had a hidden past that has been deliberately neglected by the history books, especially if that past was related to water. We need to locate and explore all substantial points of transition, starting with our first three obvious choices. Almost all of the great medieval ecclesiastic structures in Britain are a collage of different time periods and styles. One of the primary stylistic fusions is between that of the Romanesque or Norman and then the later Gothic style. Many historians do not agree when it comes to ascribing a date for the inception of Romanesque Norman-style architecture. Some ascribing it to early in the Middle Ages and some later. But what is important is that Gothic began to dominate in the 1100s here. Hereford Cathedral illustrates this collage of styles perfectly. The oldest surviving parts of Hereford are its south transept and central nave. These are the Norman areas of the structure. Here is a photograph of the south transept, and these two arches here are distinctively Norman. As you can see, this part of the cathedral is evidently a lot older than the rest. We also see a Gothic arch in direct contrast with this rounded arch, and we see the tracery of the Gothic arch is a lot less weathered. And although very weathered, you can see a key stylistic imprint of Norman architecture here. If we venture inside Hereford to an area that's not been exposed to the elements, you can get a feel of this vocabulary. Enormous and squat rounded piers and rounded arches with bold geometric chevrons or zigzags reminiscent of electric vaults or chains. The Romanesque Norman style is characteristically very different from the Gothic. It does not feature copious amounts of detail and decoration. It does not use its decoration to convey religious motifs. It emphasizes stark geometry. When it does incorporate sculpture, it appears pagan in contrast to the later Gothic style. And the majority of Britain's oldest cathedrals and abbeys carry imprints of this early Norman style, before Gothic became dominant in the 1100s. There are two kinds of medieval cathedral in England, ones that are a fusion, part Norman and part Gothic, and others that are primarily Gothic. Lichfield was originally a Norman cathedral, but it was razed to the ground in 1195 and replaced by the Gothic structure we see today. The rise of the Gothic is our first potential point of transition. Why did this stylistic change occur? Is it worth pursuing as a genuine moment of significant change? And can we trust the timeline they give us here? We need to verify the legitimacy of the historical timeline.